I'm Edward, your host, and it's a pleasure to share this quiet moment with you. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you listening from tonight? And do you prefer escaping to the sea or heading for the mountains? Write it below and subscribe for a new mystery every day. Now, settle back and enjoy the story. Chapter 1. The Tide That Barely Rose. The village of Gull's Cove had always taken a certain quiet pride in its position along the coast. It was not one of the fashionable resorts that attracted motor coaches and summer crowds, nor was it entirely forgotten by the world beyond. Rather, it occupied that particular middle ground so characteristic of English seaside communities in the years following the war. Pleasant without being remarkable, respectable without being dull, and sufficiently removed from London to discourage casual visitors while remaining accessible to those with genuine reason to visit. The cove itself, from which the village took its name, was a modest affair. At high tide, the water advanced no more than 20 yards up the gently sloping beach, and even then it barely reached a grown person's knees. Local children paddled there on warm afternoons, and elderly residents took constitutional walks along the firm sand when the tide was out. The sea was calm and predictable, as unthreatening as a village pond, and no one in living memory had come to harm in its shallow embrace. It was this very gentleness that made the events of that warm August morning, in 1952, so particularly unsettling. Miss Jane Marple had been staying with her old friends, the Bantrys, at their summer cottage just outside the village. Colonel Bantry had discovered the place quite by accident the previous year and had pronounced it ideal for a quiet seaside holiday, far enough from St Mary Mead to feel like a proper excursion, yet close enough to return home should anything require attention. Mrs. Bantry had agreed with enthusiasm, finding the local society pleasantly undemanding and the sea air beneficial to her complexion. Miss Marple had been invited to join them for a fortnight, and she had accepted with her customary graciousness. At her age, she found that a change of scene could be as restorative as any tonic, provided the surroundings remained peaceful and the company congenial. The Bantrys had assured her that Gull's Cove met both requirements admirably. On this particular morning, Miss Marple had risen early, as was her habit, and had taken her tea on the small terrace that overlooked the gardens. The weather was fine, that soft golden quality of late summer mornings when the sun has warmth but not yet the harsh brightness of midday. She had been contemplating a gentle walk into the village when Mrs. Bantry appeared at the French windows, her face displaying an expression of distress that immediately caught Miss Marple's attention. "My dear Jane," Mrs. Bantry began, her voice trembling slightly, "the most dreadful thing has happened. Mrs. Penfield from the post office has just telephoned. They've found poor Mrs. Shaw in the cove, drowned." Miss Marple set down her teacup with care. "Mrs. Shaw, the lady who keeps the lodging-house on the High Street?" "Yes, that's right. Oh, it's too terrible." "Apparently she was found early this morning by one of the fishermen. Just lying there in the shallows, poor woman. Dr. Haydock has already been called." Within the hour, the essential facts had become known throughout the village, as such facts inevitably do in small communities. Mrs. Lydia Shaw, a widow of some 55 years, proprietress of Shaw House, a modest establishment that let rooms to the quieter sort of summer visitor, had been discovered shortly after dawn. She had been lying face down in the shallow water of Gull's Cove, her grey dress darkened by the sea, her arms outstretched as though she had been reaching for something just beyond her grasp. The fisherman who had found her, a taciturn man named Garrett, had raised the alarm immediately, though it was clear even to his untrained eye that nothing could be done. Dr. Haydock, who served both Gull's Cove and the neighbouring villages, had arrived with commendable speed and had pronounced life extinct. Drowning, he had indicated, though the precise circumstances remained somewhat unclear. The tide had been exceptionally low during the night, scarcely covering the sand at all, and the water where Mrs. Shaw had been found would have reached no higher than mid-calf on a standing woman. Most likely a faint, Dr. Haydock had told Constable Warren, the local representative of law and order. Or perhaps she slipped and struck her head. These things happen, particularly with nervous women of a certain age. Mrs. Shaw had been under some strain of late, I understand. This last observation was delivered with the particular emphasis that medical men employ when they wish to suggest knowledge of circumstances without violating professional confidence. Constable Warren, a sensible man in his middle years who preferred straightforward explanations to complicated ones, had nodded with evident relief. "Very sad, of course," he had said. "But if it's a simple accident, there's no need for a great fuss. Her niece will need to be informed. Miss Mayhew, isn't it? Lives in the house with her, I believe." By the time Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry made their way to the village later that morning, the initial shock had settled into that particular state of subdued discussion that follows unexpected death. The tragedy was acknowledged, condolences were exchanged, and theories were offered with appropriate gravity. "She was always a nervous sort," remarked Mrs. Penfield from behind the post office counter, "particularly since her husband passed. That would be nearly 10 years ago now. Kept very much to herself, though she ran a respectable house, very particular about her lodgers." "I heard she'd been having difficulties lately," ventured another customer, a stout woman in a floral hat. "Money troubles, perhaps. The summer season hasn't been what it was." "Oh, I don't think it was anything like that," Mrs. Penfield said quickly. "More a matter of temperament, if you ask me. Some people simply find the world too much for them." Miss Marple, who had been examining a display of picture postcards with apparent absorption, made a small sound that might have been agreement, or might have been something else entirely. Mrs. Bantry glanced at her friend with the faint recognition of long acquaintance. "Did you know Mrs. Shaw, Jane?" she asked quietly as they left the post office. "Not at all," Miss Marple replied, "though I believe I saw her once or twice in the village. A tall woman, rather thin, with that look of someone who has learned not to expect very much from life. She dressed well, but not fashionably. Grey and navy blue, as I recall." "Poor soul," Mrs. Bantry murmured. "What a dreadful way to go." "Yes," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "though I confess I find myself rather puzzled by one small detail." "Oh? What's that?" Miss Marple paused, her gaze turning toward the Cove, which was visible at the end of the sloping street. "Mrs. Bantry, you mentioned that Dr. Haydock said the tide was particularly low last night. I happened to notice the tide chart in the post office window. According to that chart, there was no high tide at all between sunset and dawn. The water would have been at its lowest point around 11 o'clock and would have begun rising only very gradually thereafter." Mrs. Bantry looked confused. "I'm not sure I understand what you're suggesting, Jane." "Perhaps nothing at all," Miss Marple said gently. "But it does seem rather odd, doesn't it? How does one drown in water that scarcely covers one's ankles? Even if one were to faint and fall, surely the instinct would be to rise again? The water is so very shallow." Mrs. Bantry shivered despite the warmth of the morning. "You don't think, surely you're not suggesting that it wasn't an accident?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Miss Marple replied. "I'm merely observing that there are one or two small things that don't quite seem to fit together as neatly as they should. In my experience, when that happens, it's often worth paying rather closer attention to the details." She smiled then, that gentle, apologetic smile that those who knew her best had learned to recognize as signalling a particularly keen interest in the matter at hand. "But I may be entirely wrong, of course," so she added. "It would hardly be the first time that an old woman's curiosity led her to see mysteries where none existed." Mrs. Bantry, however, knew her friend rather better than that. Chapter 2. Footprints that led nowhere. The following morning brought with it that peculiar quality of stillness that sometimes settles over a village after an unexpected death. People went about their usual business, but with a certain subdued awareness, as though the ordinary rhythms of daily life had been rendered temporarily inappropriate. Voices in the shops were lowered, and even the children playing near the green seemed to sense that some measure of restraint was called for. Miss Marple had expressed a desire to take a walk along the shore, and Mrs. Bantry, understanding her friend's methods if not always her precise reasoning, had agreed to accompany her. The morning was overcast but mild, with that soft grey light that renders colours more subtle and distances more difficult to judge. They encountered Constable Warren near the entrance to the Cove path. He was a man of perhaps 45, with the solid build and deliberate movements of someone who has learned that haste rarely improves matters. His uniform was well kept, and he carried himself with the quiet authority of a person who knows his role and performs it conscientiously. "Good morning, ladies," he said, touching his helmet. "Taking the air, are you?" "We thought a walk might be pleasant," Mrs. Bantry replied. "The weather seems to be holding." "Indeed it is, madam." He paused, then added with a slight awkwardness, "I should mention that the Cove itself is still being looked at, as it were. Just routine matters following yesterday's unfortunate occurrence. Nothing to concern yourselves with, but I thought it proper to mention it." "How very thorough," Miss Marple said gently. "I'm sure Mrs. Shaw's family must be grateful for such careful attention to detail. Has anything particular come to light?" Constable Warren shifted his weight slightly. "Well, as to that, miss, I'm sorry I don't believe we've been introduced. Miss Marple, I'm staying with the Bantrys for a fortnight." "Ah, yes, of course. Well, Miss Marple, there's not much to tell, really. Dr. Haydock is satisfied it was an accidental drowning. The poor lady must have taken a turn of some kind, fainted most likely, and fallen into the water. Very tragic, but these things do happen." "And the footprints?" Miss Marple asked, her tone one of mild interest. "I understand there were footprints in the sand." The constable looked faintly surprised. "News travels quickly in a small place, doesn't it? Yes, there were prints, though nothing that tells us much. A few marks in the sand near where she was found, but the tide had been in and out since, and the wind had blown quite a bit of it about. Hard to make out anything clear. Still, one would think that if Mrs. Shaw had walked down to the Cove there would be a clear path showing where she had come from," Miss Marple suggested. "Ah, well, that's the odd bit," Constable Warren admitted. "The prints, what we could make out of them, seemed to end rather abruptly. But sand is tricky stuff, Miss Marple. Holds a mark one moment and loses it the next, depending on how the wind sits and where the water's been." "I quite understand," Miss Marple said. "And her shoes? I believe I heard someone mention that her shoes had been found." The constable's expression took on a slightly guarded quality. "That's right. Placed on one of the rocks, they were. Neat as you please, toes facing toward the sea. Some folk remove their shoes before paddling, you know, though why the poor lady would be paddling at that hour is beyond me." Miss Marple's eyes, behind her spectacles, held a thoughtful gleam. Yes, that does seem rather unusual. Had Mrs. Shaw been in the habit of walking by the Cove in the evening? "I couldn't say as to that. You'd have to ask her niece, Miss Mayhew. She'd know her aunt's habits better than anyone." He consulted his watch. "In fact, I'm due to call on her again this morning, just to settle the final details, you understand. The inquest will be held tomorrow. Pure formality, I expect." After the constable had taken his leave, Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry continued their walk in silence for a few moments. The path descended gently toward the Cove, and presently they could see the crescent of sand spread before them, the water lapping quietly at its edge. "Jane," Mrs. Bantry said at length, "you're thinking something, I can tell. What is it about those shoes that troubles you?" Miss Marple smiled. "My dear Dolly, I'm not certain that troubled is quite the word, but there is something that strikes me as rather interesting. You see, in my experience, people who remove their shoes before walking in water, particularly in the sea, generally do so only after they've reached the water's edge. One doesn't wish to walk across sand or pebbles in one's stockings. After all, the grit is most uncomfortable." "I suppose that's true," Mrs. Bantry agreed. "I always wait until the last possible moment myself." "Quite so. Yet Mrs. Shaw's shoes were found on a rock, placed there with some care, the laces tucked in neatly. That suggests deliberation rather than haste. It suggests that she sat down, removed her shoes, and arranged them thoughtfully before proceeding to the water." "Well, perhaps she did. Perhaps she intended to paddle, as Constable Warren suggested." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said. "Though I must confess, I should like to know something more about Mrs. Shaw's character. Was she the sort of woman who would, on a sudden impulse, decide to remove her shoes and paddle in the sea after dark? At her age, and alone. Mrs. Bantry considered this. You're quite right. It does seem rather out of character for someone who was described as nervous and particular. They had reached the cove itself now. The sand was firm and slightly damp, marked here and there by the traces of birds and the occasional impression of a boot heel. Miss Marple stood quietly, her gaze moving across the scene with this careful attention that a landscape painter might employ when considering the arrangement of elements in a composition. There, she said presently, indicating a spot some 15 yards from where they stood. That's where the shoes were found, I believe. One can just make out the constable's marks where he examined the area. The rock in question was a flat-topped affair, roughly knee-high, positioned well above the high-water mark. Even during the highest tide it would remain dry. Miss Marple approached it slowly, her eyes scanning the surrounding sand. You see, Dolly, she said, here is something I find rather curious. If one were to sit on this rock to remove one's shoes, and then walk toward the water, one would leave footprints in the sand, would one not? Yet according to Constable Warren, the footprints ended abruptly. They didn't lead back to this rock. They appeared near the water and went nowhere. But surely the tide barely rises at all in this cove, Miss Marple reminded her gently. That's the whole point, isn't it? This is why children paddle here safely. The water advances only a little way, even at its highest, and last night the tide was at its lowest ebb around 11 o'clock. If Mrs. Shaw was found early this morning, and if she died sometime during the evening, then the water would have been even lower when she entered it. Mrs. Bantry looked at the placid sea with new unease. You're saying the footprints should have been preserved? That they should have told a clearer story? I'm saying, Miss Marple replied carefully, that footprints in damp sand can tell us a great deal, provided they're read correctly, and when they tell us very little, or when they appear and disappear without apparent reason, then perhaps we ought to ask ourselves why that might be. She bent down with some difficulty, her knees were not what they once were, and examined the sand near the rock. After a moment, she straightened with a small nod of satisfaction. There's another thing, she said. Mrs. Shaw removed her shoes and placed them on this rock. But look at the rock itself, Dolly. It's perfectly dry. And yet if she had walked through the sand with wet feet, or even damp some stockings, surely there would be some trace of moisture on the rock where she sat, some mark of sand clinging to the stone. Mrs. Bantry peered at the rock. It is rather clean, isn't it? Remarkably so, Miss Marple agreed. Almost as though the shoes had been placed there by someone whose feet had not, in fact, been in the water at all, or at least not recently. A small silence fell between them. Out on the water a gull cried once and wheeled away toward the horizon. The sound seemed to emphasize the emptiness of the cove, the quietness of the scene where tragedy had unfolded. What are you suggesting, Jane? Mrs. Bantry asked quietly. Miss Marple sighed. I'm not entirely sure yet, my dear, but I think perhaps that poor Mrs. Shaw's last walk to this cove may not have been quite as solitary as everyone seems to assume, and I think that someone may have taken some care to arrange things in a particular way, to create, as it were, a certain appearance. An appearance of what? Of accident, Miss Marple said simply, or perhaps of something else. That's what I hope to discover. Chapter 3, A Voice Heard After Dark. The inquest was held the following afternoon in the village hall, a modest building that served various purposes throughout the year, from harvest festival displays to the occasional theatrical production by the local amateur dramatic society. On this occasion, the chairs had been arranged in neat rows facing a plain table, and the proceedings were conducted with that mixture of formality and familiarity characteristic of such events in small communities. Dr. Haydock gave his evidence with professional clarity. Death by drowning, he stated, most probably following a fainting spell or sudden weakness. The deceased had been a woman of nervous temperament, he added, and such episodes were not uncommon in persons of similar constitution. There were no signs of violence, no indication of struggle. The body had been discovered in shallow water at low tide, and the position suggested that Mrs. Shaw had fallen forward and been unable to rise. The coroner, a tired-looking gentleman who travelled a circuit of neighbouring villages, asked a few perfunctory questions and seemed satisfied with the responses. It was all proceeding exactly as Constable Warren had predicted. A tragic accident, regrettable but explicable, requiring nothing beyond official acknowledgement and sympathetic understanding. Then Mr. Albert Garrett was called to give evidence. He was a weathered man in his 60s, with the sun-creased face and calloused hands of someone who had spent a lifetime working outdoors. His Sunday suit was slightly too large for him, as though it had been purchased in more prosperous times, and he approached the witness chair with visible reluctance. "Mr. Garrett," the coroner began, "I understand you discovered the deceased on the morning of August 23rd. "That's right, sir. Just after dawn it was. I was heading down to check my nets and saw something in the water, went closer and realised it was poor Mrs. Shaw." His voice was gruff but respectful. "And you raised the alarm immediately?" "Yes, sir. Though I could see there was nothing to be done. I've seen drowned folk before." The coroner made a note. "Quite so. Now, Mr. Garrett, is there anything else you can tell us about the circumstances? Anything you observed that might be relevant?" There was a pause. Mr. Garrett shifted in his chair, and Miss Marple, seated near the back of the hall beside Mrs. Bantry, observed the hesitation with interest. It was the hesitation of a man who knows something but is uncertain whether it matters. "Well, sir," Mr. Garrett said at length, "I don't know as it's important, but I did hear voices down by the cove the evening before. Must have been around 8 o'clock or thereabouts. I was mending nets in my shed, that's just up from the cove, you see, and the window was open on account of the warmth." "Voices?" the coroner prompted. "Could you identify them?" "No, sir. Couldn't make out the words, you understand. Just voices carrying on the evening air. One was sharp-like, the other lower. Thought it was summer visitors having a bit of an argument. Happens often enough. I didn't pay it much mind." "Did you see anyone?" "No, sir. Wasn't looking, was I? And it was getting toward dusk by then." The coroner seemed to consider whether this information warranted further inquiry, then appeared to decide it did not. "Thank you, Mr. Garrett. That will be all." After Mr. Garrett had returned to his seat, Miss Clara Mayhew was called. She was a woman of perhaps 30, with a neat contained appearance that suggested both efficiency and a certain emotional reserve. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, and she wore a black dress that seemed almost too formal for mourning an aunt, as though she had borrowed the costume from some earlier, more theatrical grief. She confirmed that she was Mrs. Shaw's niece and had resided with her aunt for the past 3 years. Her voice was steady as she answered the coroner's questions, and she met his gaze directly. "Miss Mayhew, can you tell us about your aunt's state of mind in the days before her death?" "She was as usual, sir, perhaps a trifle worried about household matters, but nothing out of the ordinary. My aunt was a careful woman who took her responsibilities seriously." "Did she seem depressed or unusually anxious?" "No more than was typical for her. She had always been of a cautious disposition." "And on the evening of August 22nd, the evening before she was found, where was your aunt?" "She was at home all evening," Miss Mayhew replied without hesitation. "We had supper together at 6:30. Afterward she sat in the parlour with her needlework. I retired early with a headache. When I came down the next morning I found her bed had not been slept in, and assumed she had gone out for an early walk. It was only when Constable Warren called that I learned what had happened." "So you did not see her leave the house?" "No, sir. As I said, I had retired with a headache." The coroner made another note. "And your aunt was in the habit of walking alone in the evening?" Here, Miss Marple noticed, there was the briefest hesitation. "Occasionally, yes, when the weather was fine." "Thank you, Miss Mayhew. You have my sincere condolences." The verdict, when it came, surprised no one. Death by misadventure. The coroner expressed sympathy for the family and noted that such accidents, while rare, were not unknown. The proceedings concluded, and people began to file out into the afternoon sunshine with that mixture of relief and residual solemnity that follows the official acknowledgement of death. Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry walked slowly back toward the cottage. They had gone perhaps 100 yards when they encountered Mr. Garrett, who was standing by the churchyard wall, apparently deep in thought. "Mr. Garrett," Miss Marple said gently, "I wonder if I might trouble you for a moment." He turned, looking surprised. "Ma'am? I hope you'll forgive an old woman's curiosity, but I was very interested in what you said about hearing voices that evening. I'm something of a student of village life, you see, and I find these small details quite fascinating." Mr. Garrett seemed uncertain how to respond to this. "Well, ma'am, I'm not sure there was much to it. Just voices, as I said. But you mentioned that one was sharp and one was lower. When you say sharp, do you mean higher in pitch? A woman's voice, perhaps?" He considered this. Could have been, or it might have been a man speaking sharp-like. Hard to say when you're not paying proper attention. And the other voice, the lower one, that would have been a man's voice? "I'd say so, yes. Though mind you, I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. Sound carries oddly near the water, especially in the evening. Sometimes you hear things that are farther off than you'd think." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed. "And you said you thought it was an argument." Mr. Garrett shifted his weight. "Well, the tone of it was like that, not shouting exactly, but not friendly conversation either. The kind of talk people have when they're not in agreement about something." "I see. And this would have been around 8 o'clock?" "Thereabouts. I can't be more precise than that." Miss Marple thanked him warmly, and he touched his cap before continuing on his way. Mrs. Bantry waited until he was out of earshot before speaking. "What are you thinking, Jane?" "I'm thinking," Miss Marple replied slowly, "that Miss Mayhew stated very clearly that her aunt was at home all evening. She said it promptly, as though the answer had been prepared beforehand. And yet Mr. Garrett heard voices at the Cove around 8 o'clock, one sharp, one low. If one of those voices belonged to Mrs. Shaw, then Miss Mayhew's account cannot be entirely accurate. Perhaps Miss Mayhew was mistaken. Perhaps her aunt did go out for a brief walk." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, "though I noticed something else about Miss Mayhew's testimony. When the coroner asked if her aunt was in the habit of walking alone in the evening, there was a pause before she answered. A very small pause, but a pause nonetheless. It's the sort of pause people make when they're choosing their words with particular care. You think she was lying?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that she was answering with precision rather than with candour. There's a difference, you know. One can tell the truth in such a way that the truth becomes misleading. It's a skill that many people acquire, usually quite unconsciously, when they wish to avoid difficult questions." They walked on in silence for a few moments, the afternoon sun warm on their shoulders. "The question is," Miss Marple said at length, "why would Miss Mayhew wish to create the impression that her aunt was alone all evening? What purpose does such an impression serve?" Mrs. Bantry had no answer. To that, and Miss Marple, it seemed, was content to leave the question hanging in the air between them unanswered but not forgotten. Chapter 4. Shoes left facing the sea. The day following the inquest brought rain. A soft, persistent drizzle that obscured the horizon and turned the village streets to gleaming grey. It was the sort of weather that encouraged indoor pursuits and quiet reflection, and Miss Marple found herself grateful for the excuse to spend the morning in the Bantry's comfortable sitting room with her knitting. Mrs. Bantry, who had been attempting to read the same page of her novel for the past quarter hour, finally set the book aside with an audible sigh. "I can't stop thinking about it, Jane. About poor Mrs. Shaw, and those voices Mr. Garrett heard, and the way Miss Mayhew spoke at the inquest. Do you really think there's something suspicious about it all?" Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily as she worked on what appeared to be the sleeve of a small cardigan. "I think, my dear, that there are several elements that don't quite align with the official explanation. Whether that constitutes something suspicious or merely something puzzling remains to be seen. But what can you possibly do about it? The inquest has delivered its verdict, and everyone seems satisfied except you." "Not everyone," Miss Marple corrected gently. "I suspect Constable Warren has a few lingering doubts, though he's far too sensible to voice them without evidence. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if Dr. Haydock found certain aspects of the case rather unusual. though medical men are trained to accept the most probable explanation in the absence of clear evidence to the contrary. She paused in her knitting and looked up. But you're quite right that I can't do very much in an official capacity. However, there's nothing to prevent an elderly visitor from taking an interest in village life and asking the sort of questions that elderly visitors are expected to ask. People are remarkably willing to talk to someone they perceive as harmless. Mrs. Bantry smiled despite herself. You're about as harmless as a steel trap, Jane Marple, and you know it. My dear Dolly, what a flattering comparison. That afternoon, when the rain had diminished to a fine mist, Miss Marple announced her intention to call upon Miss Mayhew. Mrs. Bantry, who had learned long ago not to question her friend's methods, merely offered to accompany her, an offer that was accepted with appreciation. Shore House stood on the high street, a tall, narrow building of grey stone with a small brass plate beside the door that read Select Accommodations. The windows were clean, the doorstep scrubbed, and the general impression was one of respectable efficiency rather than warmth. It was, Miss Marple reflected, exactly the sort of establishment one would expect from a woman described as particular and not easy to please. Miss Mayhew answered their knock herself. She wore the same severe dark dress as at the inquest, and her expression, while polite, suggested that social calls were not something she particularly welcomed. Miss Mayhew, Mrs. Bantry began, please forgive us for intruding at such a difficult time. My friend, Miss Marple, wished to offer her condolences. We're staying nearby, you see, and felt it would be courteous to call. The younger woman's face softened slightly. That's very kind of you. Won't you come in? The parlour to which they were shown was furnished in the manner of a generation past. Heavy furniture, antimacassars on every chair, and a collection of sepia photographs arranged on the mantelpiece. Everything was scrupulously clean, but there was a staleness to the air, as though windows were opened only when absolutely necessary. I hope we're not keeping you from anything, Miss Marple said as they settled into their chairs. I know there must be so many arrangements to make at a time like this. The funeral is to be on Saturday, Miss Mayhew replied. A quiet affair. My aunt would have wished it so. She was never one for unnecessary display. She sounds as though she was a woman of considerable dignity, Miss Marple observed. I confess I never had the pleasure of meeting her, though I did see her once or twice in the village. A tall lady, if I remember correctly, who dressed with great propriety. Yes, my aunt was very particular about appearances. She believed that one's dress reflected one's character. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. I quite agree with that sentiment. In fact, I've often thought that one can learn a great deal about a person from their footwear. Shoes particularly tell such interesting stories, whether someone is practical or frivolous, careful or careless. She paused, then added, as though it had just occurred to her, I understand your aunt's shoes were found quite neatly arranged on one of the rocks by the cove. A flicker of something passed across Miss Mayhew's face, surprise perhaps, or wariness. Yes, that's what Constable Warren told me. I suppose she must have removed them before going into the water. How curious, Miss Marple said mildly. I wonder if your aunt was in the habit of removing her shoes when she walked by the sea? I couldn't say. As I mentioned at the inquest, I had retired early that evening with a headache. I don't know exactly what my aunt did after I went upstairs. Of course, but I meant more generally in her usual habits. Did she enjoy paddling, for instance? Some people find it most refreshing. Miss Mayhew's hands, which had been resting in her lap, tightened slightly. My aunt was not given to that sort of thing. She considered it rather undignified for a woman of her years. Then it does seem rather odd that she would have removed her shoes at all, Miss Marple said. Unless perhaps they were uncomfortable. One sometimes removes uncomfortable shoes at the end of a long day. My aunt's shoes were always well fitted. She had them made specially by a cobbler in the next village. She suffered from bunions and required particular attention to such matters. Miss Marple's expression brightened with interest. How sensible! I myself have had difficulties with my feet over the years. Not bunion, thankfully, but a tendency toward corns that can be most troublesome. A good cobbler is worth his weight in gold, isn't he? Though I imagine the shoes your aunt was wearing that evening must have been quite worn if she chose to walk any distance in them. Walking shoes do wear out so quickly, particularly along a sandy beach." "Actually," Miss Mayhew said, then stopped. After a moment she continued, "I believe the shoes she was wearing were relatively new. She had only had them a few months." "Indeed? Then it seems all the more peculiar that she would remove them. New shoes are generally the ones we're most careful with, aren't they? At least until they've had time to acquire a few scuffs and scratches." A silence descended on the room. Miss Mayhew's eyes had taken on a distant quality, as though she were working through some internal calculation. Miss Marple waited patiently, her own expression one of mild, sympathetic interest. "Miss Marple," Miss Mayhew said at length, "may I ask why you're so interested in my aunt's shoes?" "Oh, my dear, I do apologize if my questions seem impertinent. It's a failing of mine, I'm afraid, an excessive curiosity about small details. When one has lived as long as I have in a small village, one develops the habit of noticing such things. And I must confess, the whole situation has reminded me so much of something that happened in St. Mary Mead some years ago." "What sort of thing?" Miss Marple settled more comfortably in her chair, as though preparing to share a story. "It involved a gentleman who was found drowned in a quite shallow pond. Everyone assumed he had slipped and struck his head, much as people are assuming about your poor aunt. But there were certain small details that didn't quite fit. His hat was placed on the bank, you see, rather than having fallen into the water with him, and his walking stick was lying at an angle that suggested he had set it down deliberately rather than dropping it." "And what was the explanation?" "It turned out that the gentleman had been accompanied to the pond by someone else, someone who had helped him remove his hat and take hold of his walking stick before he entered the water. The other person had assumed the gentleman would simply wade out and return. When the gentleman slipped and fell, the other person had panicked and run away, leaving everything arranged just as it was. It wasn't murder exactly, but it wasn't quite an accident either. It was something in between, a failure to help when help was desperately needed." Miss Mayhew had grown very still. "I see." "The person in question," Miss Marple continued, "had been terribly frightened, you understand, frightened of scandal, frightened of being blamed, frightened of having to explain what they were doing there in the first place. Fear makes people do such extraordinary things, doesn't it? Things they would never normally consider." The younger woman's voice, when she spoke, was barely above a whisper. "Yes, I suppose it does." Miss Marple rose to her feet, and Mrs. Bantry followed suit. "We've taken up quite enough of your time, Miss Mayhew. Thank you for receiving us so graciously. Please know that you have my deepest sympathy during this difficult period." As they made their way back through the rain-dampened streets, Mrs. Bantry glanced at her friend with barely concealed curiosity. "Jane, did that really happen in St. Mary Mead? That story about the gentleman in the pond?" Miss Marple's eyes held a faint twinkle. "Not precisely, my dear, but something very like it happened in a novel I once read. I've found that people are sometimes more willing to recognize truth when it's presented as fiction. It gives them a certain distance from which to view things more clearly. Do you think Miss Mayhew recognized something in your story?" "I think," Miss Marple said quietly, "that Miss Mayhew is carrying a very heavy burden indeed. Whether she chooses to set it down remains to be seen." Chapter 5. What the Cove usually knew. The village, in the days following the inquest, had settled into that state of quiet absorption that follows the official resolution of unusual events. The verdict had been delivered, the funeral arrangements made, and life was expected to resume its customary rhythm. Yet Miss Marple had observed in her long experience of village communities that official verdicts rarely silence speculation entirely. People continued to discuss, to wonder, and to remember, particularly when the official explanation left certain questions unanswered. It was in the small tea shop on the high street that Miss Marple found herself most usefully informed. Mrs. Bantry had expressed a desire for scones, and they had accordingly presented themselves at the Copper Kettle just as the afternoon trade was beginning. The proprietress, a comfortable woman named Mrs. Phelps, presided over her domain with the quiet authority of someone who has heard every piece of village news within an hour of its occurrence. "Such a terrible thing about poor Mrs. Shaw," Mrs. Phelps remarked as she set down their tea. "Though between you and me, she wasn't the easiest person to get along with. Very particular she was, had opinions about everything and wasn't shy about sharing them." Miss Marple poured milk into her cup with careful attention. "I suppose that must have made things difficult for her niece." "Miss Mayhew?" "Oh, she managed well enough. Quiet sort of girl, keeps herself to herself. Been living with her aunt these past 3 years, ever since her mother passed. Mrs. Shaw was her mother's sister, you see. Took Clara in out of duty, I expect, rather than affection." "How unfortunate," Miss Marple murmured. "To live in a house without warmth must be quite trying." Mrs. Phelps lowered her voice, though there were no other customers within earshot. "Well, Mrs. Shaw had her reasons for being the way she was, I suppose. Her husband died quite suddenly. Heart. It was, and she never really recovered from the shock. Turned inward, if you know what I mean. Started seeing difficulties where there weren't any and taking offence at perfectly innocent remarks. It must have affected her business, Mrs. Bantry suggested. A lodging house requires a certain welcoming atmosphere, doesn't it? That's just it. She only took one lodger these past few years. Mr. Blunt. Edwin Blunt, a gentleman from London who comes down for his health. Very respectable, very quiet. He'd been staying with her every summer for nearly a decade, regular as clockwork. Same room, same arrangements, never any trouble." Miss Marple's interest sharpened, though her expression remained one of polite attention. How pleasant for Mrs. Shaw to have such a reliable guest. I imagine that must have provided a steady income. "You'd think so, wouldn't you? But here's the odd thing. Just a few weeks ago, Mrs. Shaw told Mr. Blunt she wouldn't be taking him on any more. After all those years, said she was thinking of selling the house and didn't want the complication of lodgers." "My goodness," Miss Marple said. "That does seem rather sudden. How did Mr. Blunt take the news?" Mrs. Phelps refilled their teacups. "Well, that's what everyone found so strange. He didn't make any fuss at all. Just thanked her politely and said he quite understood. Found himself rooms at the Mariner's Rest down by the harbour. Not nearly as nice as what he'd been used to, I might add. But he bore it all with perfect good grace." "He sounds like a most agreeable gentleman." "Oh, he is. Always pleasant, always courteous. Keeps regular hours, takes his constitutional along the beach every evening. You can set your watch by him. In fact," Mrs. Phelps glanced toward the window, "that's him just passing now, the gentleman in the grey suit." Miss Marple looked up in time to see a tall, slender man walking past the tea-shop window. He was perhaps 60 years of age, with a mild, scholarly appearance and the slightly stooped posture of someone who spends much time reading. His grey suit was well maintained but not new, and he carried a walking stick which he used more for habit than necessity. His face wore the expression of someone engaged in pleasant but solitary thoughts. "He does look most respectable," Miss Marple observed. "Oh, he is, though I must say it can't have been pleasant for him, being turned out like that after so many years. Mrs. Shaw could have given him more notice at the very least. But that was her way. Once she'd decided something, there was no discussing it. After they had finished their tea and emerged into the afternoon sunshine, Miss Marple suggested a walk along the High Street. It was not long before they encountered Mr. Blunt himself, who had paused to examine the notices in the post-office window. "Good afternoon," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "Such lovely weather we're having." Mr. Blunt turned and smiled, a gentle, rather wistful smile. "Indeed, yes. One of the pleasures of this part of the world is that even in late August the air remains fresh." His voice was cultured, with the careful diction of an educated man who has perhaps spent time abroad. "You're a visitor here, I believe?" Miss Marple ventured. "A regular visitor, I should say. I've been coming to Gull's Cove for many years. For my health, you understand, the sea air is most beneficial for those of us with weak constitutions." He said this without self-pity, merely as a statement of fact. "How fortunate that you found such a congenial place, though I understand there have been some changes to your arrangements recently." Mr. Blunt's expression clouded slightly. "Ah, you've heard about Mrs. Shaw, I expect. Yes, it's been most unfortunate. A tragic accident, they say. Such a waste of life." "You knew her well, I imagine, having lodged with her for so many years." "As well as anyone knew her, I suppose. She was not a woman who invited intimacy, but we had achieved, I thought, a comfortable understanding. She provided excellent accommodation, and I was a considerate tenant. It seemed a satisfactory arrangement for both parties." "Until recently," Miss Marple said gently. Mr. Blunt looked at her with sudden sharpness, as though reassessing his initial impression of a harmless elderly lady. "You're very well informed for someone who's only visiting. Forgive me, I don't mean to pry, but I understand Mrs. Shaw told you she could no longer accommodate you." "Yes." His voice had become more reserved. "She informed me some weeks ago that she was considering selling the house and would not be continuing with lodgers. I found alternative arrangements. These things happen." "Must have been disappointing nonetheless." "Disappointing, yes, but one learns to accept such changes with equanimity. Life rarely proceeds exactly as we would wish." He glanced at his watch. "I'm afraid you must excuse me. I take a walk along the beach each evening at this hour. A matter of routine, you understand." "Of course, it was pleasant speaking with you, Mr. Blunt." He touched his hat and continued on his way, his walking stick tapping a steady rhythm on the pavement. Mrs. Bantry waited until he was out of earshot. "What did you make of him, Jane?" "I think," Miss Marple said slowly, "that Mr. Blunt is a man who values routine very highly indeed. Routine and predictability and the comfort of familiar arrangements. I think that having those things disrupted would have been more than merely disappointing. For someone like Mr. Blunt, it would have been deeply distressing." "Distressing enough to—" Mrs. Bantry left the question unfinished. "That," Miss Marple said, "remains to be seen." Chapter 6. Politeness that interrupted truth. Mrs. Shaw's funeral took place on Saturday morning beneath a sky of uncertain grey. The service was brief and sparsely attended. Miss Mayhew, of course, a handful of village residents who felt that propriety required their presence, and a scattering of others whose connection to the deceased was less immediately apparent. Mr. Blunt was among the latter group, standing at a respectful distance and bearing himself with the quiet dignity that seemed characteristic of him. Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry, who had thought it courteous to attend, observed the proceedings from their position near the back of the small churchyard. The vicar spoke the familiar words with practised sympathy, and the villagers murmured their responses. Miss Mayhew stood very straight throughout, her face composed but pale, her black-gloved hands clasped tightly before her. After the service had concluded, and the small assembly had begun to disperse, Miss Marple found herself walking alongside Mrs. Phelps from the tea-shop. "A sad occasion," Mrs. Phelps remarked, "though I must say it went as well as these things can. The vicar spoke nicely, didn't he? Though of course he didn't know Mrs. Shaw very well. She wasn't one for regular church attendance." "These formal occasions are never easy," Miss Marple agreed, "particularly when the death was so unexpected. I imagine people are still coming to terms with what happened." "Well, there's been talk, naturally. There always is in a place like this, though most people seem to accept it was an accident, pure and simple." "Most people," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully, "but not everyone." Mrs. Phelps lowered her voice, though they were walking alone along the path that led away from the churchyard. "Well, I shouldn't repeat gossip, but there was something Mrs. Fletcher mentioned the other day. You know Mrs. Fletcher lives in one of the cottages near the harbour." "I don't believe I've had the pleasure." "Elderly lady, keeps to herself mostly, but she happened to mention that she had seen Mr. Blunt walking back from the direction of the Cove that evening, the evening Mrs. Shaw died. Must have been around 8:30, she said. She remembered it particularly because he passed right by her gate, and she'd been sitting outside enjoying the last of the daylight." Miss Marple's expression remained mild. "I see. And did she speak to him?" "That's just it, she didn't. Said she thought about calling out a good evening, the way one does, but something made her hold back. He looked, she said, as though he didn't wish to be disturbed, very preoccupied, walking quickly with his head down." "How interesting." And did Mrs. Fletcher mention this to anyone at the time? Mrs. Phelps hesitated. Well, no. That's the thing, isn't it? She didn't think anything of it until after Mrs. Shaw was found. And then she felt it would be awkward to bring it up. What with Mr. Blunt being such a respectable gentleman and all, she didn't want to cause trouble for him when he'd done nothing wrong. Of course not, Miss Marple said gently. One wouldn't wish to appear to be making accusations when there's a perfectly innocent explanation. Exactly. Mr. Blunt had every right to take a walk in the evening. Lots of people do. And just because he happened to be near the Cove around at the same time that Mrs. Shaw, well, it doesn't mean anything, does it? Perhaps not, Miss Marple agreed. Though I confess I'm curious. Did Mr. Blunt mention at the inquest that he had been near the Cove that evening? I don't recall that he gave evidence at all. The coroner only called those who had something direct to contribute, and I suppose Mr. Blunt didn't fall into that category. They had reached the point where their paths diverged, and after exchanging farewells, Miss Marple continued on with Mrs. Bantry toward the cottage. Her friend had been listening to the conversation with growing interest. Jay, this is becoming rather serious, isn't it? If Mr. Blunt was at the Cove that evening, and if those voices Mr. Garrett heard belonged to him and Mrs. Shaw, then it would suggest that they had a conversation, Miss Marple finished. Yes, it would, though of course conversation between two people is not evidence of wrongdoing. Many conversations take place every day without anyone coming to harm. But why wouldn't he mention it? If it was entirely innocent, why keep silent? That, Miss Marple said, is indeed the question. Though I suspect the answer has something to do with what Mrs. Phelps just described, that peculiarly English reluctance to cause awkwardness or draw attention to oneself. We're trained from childhood, aren't we? Not to push forward, not to volunteer information unless specifically asked, not to create difficulties where none appear to exist. Over the next 2 days, Miss Marple made it her business to speak with several other residents of Gull's Cove. She did so with the casual friendliness of a visitor who was naturally interested in her temporary surroundings, and she found people remarkably willing to chat with an elderly lady who seemed harmless and genuinely engaged by village life. From the baker, she learned that Mr. Blunt had purchased 2 currant buns on the afternoon before Mrs. Shaw's death. His usual purchase, nothing remarkable. From the woman who ran the lending library, she discovered that Mr. Blunt had returned a volume of poetry that same afternoon, and had inquired whether they had anything by Tennyson, as he found the poet soothing to his nerves. From the postmaster's wife, she gathered that Mr. Blunt had seemed perfectly ordinary in the days following Mrs. Shaw's death, perhaps a trifle quieter than usual, but then the whole village had been subdued by the tragedy. What emerged from these various conversations was a portrait of a man who had conducted himself with absolute propriety throughout. He had not fled the village, had not altered his routines in any dramatic way, had not given any sign of guilt or distress beyond what might be expected from someone who had known the deceased. And yet, Miss Marple found herself thinking about Mrs. Fletcher, sitting outside her cottage in the evening light, and noticing Mr. Blunt walk past with his head down, looking as though he didn't wish to be disturbed. She thought about the voices Mr. Garrett had heard, one sharp, one low. She thought about the careful arrangement of shoes on the rock and the absence of footprints leading back toward the village. Most of all, she thought about the peculiar power of politeness to obscure truth. How many people had seen something, noticed something, wondered about something, and then dismissed it because to speak up would have been awkward? How many times had someone thought it better to say nothing than to risk causing offence or drawing attention to themselves? In St. Mary Mead she had seen the same pattern countless times. Someone would know something or suspect something but would remain silent out of a misplaced sense of decorum. And by the time the truth emerged, if it emerged at all, it was often too late to prevent harm. That evening, as she sat with her knitting in the Bantry sitting room, Miss Marple made a decision. The time for indirect observation was drawing to a close. If she wished to understand what had truly happened in the shallow waters of Gull's Cove, she would need to speak with Mr. Blunt directly. The question was how to approach him without alarming him, how to frame her inquiry so. queries in such a way that he might be willing to speak honestly rather than retreating behind the same wall of polite reticence that the rest of the village seemed to have erected. She recalled something her nephew Raymond had once said about cross-examination, that the key was not to ask questions that could be answered with prepared responses, but rather to approach the truth obliquely, from angles the subject had now anticipated. It was, she reflected, not so very different from village conversation. One didn't demand information directly. One created an atmosphere in which the truth might emerge naturally, almost despite the speaker's intentions. "Dolly," she said, looking up from her knitting, "I wonder if you'd be willing to accompany me on a walk tomorrow afternoon. I thought we might take the path along the beach, the one that leads past the Mariner's Rest. I understand the views are quite lovely at that time of day." Mrs. Bantry, who understood perfectly well that her friend's interest in scenic views was secondary to other considerations, smiled. "Of course, Jane, I'd be delighted." Chapter 7. A Hand That Let Go. The following afternoon brought weather more suited to early autumn than late summer. A brisk wind from the sea and clouds that moved swiftly across a sky of changeable blue. Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry set out along the coastal path shortly after luncheon, both wrapped in cardigans against the freshening breeze. The Mariner's Rest stood at the far end of the village, a modest establishment that catered to the less affluent sort of visitor. It was respectable without being comfortable, clean without being welcoming, the sort of place one stayed when economics dictated compromise. Miss Marple had learned from the postmaster's wife that Mr. Blunt took his afternoon tea in the small residence lounge at precisely 3:30, a routine he had maintained since relocating from Shore House. They arrived at 20 minutes past the hour and settled themselves in the lounge with a pot of tea. The room was empty save for themselves and an elderly gentleman who was dozing over a newspaper in the corner. The furniture was worn but serviceable, and a window overlooked the harbour where fishing boats rocked gently at their moorings. Mr. Blunt appeared at precisely 3:30, as predicted. He paused in the doorway upon seeing the room occupied, and Miss Marple observed a flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps, or merely the discomfort of a solitary person confronted with unexpected company. "Mr. Blunt," she said pleasantly, "how nice to see you again. Won't you join us? We seem to have ordered far too much tea for just the two of us." He hesitated, caught between the impulse to retreat and the requirements of courtesy. Courtesy won, as Miss Marple had suspected it would. "That's very kind of you," he said, settling into a chair at a careful distance, "though I shouldn't wish to intrude on your conversation." "Not at all. In fact, I've been hoping for an opportunity to speak with you. You see, I've been staying in Gulls Cove for nearly a fortnight now, and I've become quite interested in the village and its history. Mrs. Bantry tells me you've been visiting for many years. You must know it far better than most." "I've been coming here since 1943, Mr. Blunt said. His voice took on a quality of reminiscence. "During the war, it was recommended for my lungs. The doctors said sea air and quiet surroundings would be beneficial. I found both here, and I've returned every summer since." "How fortunate that you found such a suitable place, and you stayed with Mrs. Shaw all those years." "Until recently, yes," his expression clouded. "A most unfortunate business, her death. I still find it difficult to believe. She seemed in perfectly ordinary health when I last saw her." "When was that?" Miss Marple asked, her tone one of gentle interest. "The evening before she died. I encountered her quite by chance as I was taking my constitutional walk. We exchanged a few words." Mrs. Bantry poured more tea, the clink of china providing a domestic counterpoint to the conversation. Miss Marple accepted her cup with a small nod of thanks. "Where did this encounter take place?" she asked. Mr. Blunt's hands, which had been resting calmly in his lap, moved slightly. "Near the Cove. I had walked down to the beach, as I often do. Mrs. Shaw was there as well, sitting on one of the rocks, I believe. It was still quite light, though dusk was approaching." "And you spoke with her?" "Briefly, yes. We discussed—" He paused, seeming to choose his words with care. "We discussed practical matters, the selling of her house principally. She had mentioned it when she told me I would need to find other accommodation, but I had hoped she might reconsider. The Mariner's Rest is adequate, but it lacks the comfort and quiet I had grown accustomed to. I quite understand. Change is always unsettling, particularly when one has established pleasant routines. Did Mrs. Shaw seem receptive to reconsidering? No. The single word was delivered with a flatness that suggested disappointment long since absorbed. She was quite firm on the subject, said her mind was made up and there was no purpose in further discussion. I'm afraid I may have pressed the point more than was entirely proper. It had been such a shock, you see, receiving her notice. After so many years of mutual satisfaction, to be told so abruptly that the arrangement was ending. It must have been deeply distressing, Miss Marple said sympathetically. It was. More than I perhaps realised at the time. I'd come to depend upon those rooms, that regularity. To have it disrupted felt... He stopped, seeming suddenly aware that he was revealing more than he had intended. But I'm certain you're not interested in the complaints of an elderly man who has failed to adapt to changing circumstances. On the contrary, I find it entirely natural. Stability is precious, particularly as one grows older. The loss of it can feel quite devastating, even when others might see it as a minor inconvenience. Mr. Blunt looked at her with something approaching gratitude. Yes, exactly that. You understand, Ma. So you parted from Mrs. Shaw that evening, without having changed her mind? We parted, he said, his voice becoming more careful again, on civil terms. I wished her good evening and continued my walk. When I returned past the cove some 20 minutes later, she was no longer there. I assumed she'd gone home. And you didn't think to mention this encounter to Constable Warren, or at the inquest? The question hung in the air between them. Mr. Blunt's face had taken on a guarded expression. I saw no reason to complicate matters. The coroner had ruled it an accident. My conversation with Mrs. Shaw had no bearing on that verdict. To have come forward would only have invited unnecessary speculation and perhaps cast suspicion where none was warranted. I see, Miss Marple said quietly. You were protecting yourself from awkward question. I was avoiding creating difficulties where none existed, he corrected. Surely you can understand that. In my position, a stranger to the village, the very person who had been displaced by Mrs. Shaw's decision, any mention of having been with her that evening would have been interpreted most unfavourably. Even though you did nothing wrong. Even then. His voice had grown firm. The appearance of impropriety is often as damaging as impropriety itself. I have lived long enough to know that truth is not always its own defence. Miss Marple set down her teacup. Mr. Blunt, I must ask you something directly, and I hope you'll forgive the indelicacy of the question. When you encountered Mrs. Shaw at the Cove, was she alone? He blinked, as though surprised by this line of inquiry. Yes, entirely alone. Why do you ask? And during your conversation, did you touch her at all? Take her arm, perhaps, or offer to assist her in any way? The colour drained from his face. How did you... He stopped, collecting himself. There was a moment when she stood to leave. The rock was slightly awkward to climb down from, and I offered my hand. She accepted it, though she pulled away rather quickly. I thought perhaps she found my assistance presumptuous. Did she seem unsteady? No more than anyone might be when navigating uneven stone. Why are you asking me these things? Miss Marple's voice was very gentle. Because de Haydock noted a small bruise on Mrs. Shaw's wrist. Nothing significant, the sort of mark that might come from a steadying hand held a bit too firmly, or from someone resisting assistance. It was dismissed as incidental, but it suggests that someone was with her, helping her, or attempting to help her, shortly before she died. Mr. Blunt had gone very still. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I helped her down from the rock. I held her wrist for just a moment to steady her. Then she said she wished to be alone, and I released her. That was all. I swear to you, that was all. And then you walked away? Yes, I walked along the beach for a time, thinking about our conversation and what it meant for my future. When I returned, she was gone. I assumed she had gone home. It never occurred to me that... He broke off, his hands trembling slightly. Miss Marple leaned forward. Mr. Blunt, I need you to think very carefully about what happened next. After you released Mrs. Shaw's wrist, What did she do? She turned away from me, toward the water. And you didn't follow her? No. She had made it clear she wished to be left alone. I respected that. I walked in the opposite direction. But you said you returned past the cove 20 minutes later? Yes. And she was gone by then? Yes. Miss Marple's eyes were very steady on his face. Mr. Blunt, did you hear anything during those 20 minutes? A cry, perhaps? A splash? His face crumpled. I don't know. I truly don't know. I may have heard something, a sound that could have been many things, but I was absorbed in my own thoughts, and the wind was rising. If there was a cry, I didn't recognize it as such. Not then. Chapter 8. When Silence Was Misunderstood. The lounge at the Mariner's Rest had grown very quiet. The elderly gentleman in the corner continued to doze, unaware of the conversation unfolding near the window. Outside, the clouds had thickened, and the first drops of rain began to spatter against the glass. Mr. Blunt sat with his head bowed, his hands clasped tightly together. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of something long held inside. I've thought about it every day since, every hour, almost. What I might have done differently. Whether that sound I heard was her calling for help, and whether I could have saved her if I had only turned back. But you didn't turn back, Miss Marple said gently. It was not an accusation, merely a statement of fact. No, I was angry, you see, not violently angry. I'm not a violent man, but frustrated and disappointed, and feeling rather sorry for myself, after 10 years of perfect tenancy, to be dismissed with such little consideration. It felt unjust. So when she asked to be left alone, I was happy to oblige. I thought, let her sit there in solitude if that's what she wants. I'll take my walk and leave her to her thoughts. How long did you walk? Mrs. Bantry asked. 20 minutes, perhaps slightly more. I went along the beach toward the eastern headland. It's a walk I often take. There are interesting rock formations there, and the exercise is beneficial. When I returned, I passed the cove again, and she was no longer on the rock where I'd left her. I assumed she had grown tired of sitting and had gone home. Did you look for her? Miss Marple asked. No, the word was heavy with regret. It didn't occur to me to look. Why would it? She was a woman in her own village, in familiar surroundings, in no apparent distress. The tide was out, the water was shallow. There was no reason to think anything was amiss. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And when you heard the news the next morning? I was horrified, of course, and then he stopped, his face working with emotion. And then I was terrified, because I realized that if I told anyone I'd been with her that evening, they would ask exactly the questions you're asking now. They would want to know what we discussed, whether we argued, whether I touched her. And the answers to those questions, innocent though they were, would make me appear guilty of something far worse than I had actually done. Which was? Nothing, he said, his voice breaking slightly. That's precisely the point, isn't it? I did nothing. When she might have needed help, I did nothing because I didn't know she needed it. And when I learned what had happened, I did nothing because I was afraid of being blamed for circumstances beyond my control. The rain had intensified now, drumming against the window with a steady rhythm that seemed to underscore the heaviness of the moment. Miss Marple sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, her expression thoughtful. Mr. Blunt, she said at length, I'd like to understand exactly what happened during your conversation with Mrs. Shaw. You said you discussed the selling of the house. Did she give any reason for her decision beyond what she had already told you? He looked up, surprised by the shift in questioning. She said she wanted a fresh start, that Shaw House held too many memories of her late husband, and that continuing to let rooms had become burdensome. She mentioned something about Miss Mayhew deserving better than to spend her life managing a lodging house. Did that strike you as odd? At the time, no. Upon reflection, yes, rather. Mrs. Shaw had never struck me as someone particularly concerned with her niece's welfare. Their relationship seemed cordial but not warm, yet she spoke of Miss Mayhew's future with what seemed like genuine consideration. And how did Mrs. Shaw seem in herself? Her manner, her demeanour? Mr. Blunt considered this carefully. She seemed resolved. Yes, that's the word. Resolved to a course of action, as though she had made a difficult decision and was determined to see it through. But there was also something else, a kind of distraction perhaps, as though part of her mind was elsewhere. Did she seem afraid? Afraid? He looked startled by the suggestion. No, I wouldn't say afraid. Preoccupied, certainly. Troubled, perhaps, but not frightened. Miss Marple was silent for a moment, her gaze directed toward the window, but her thoughts clearly turned inward. Mrs. Bantry had learned to recognize this expression. It meant her friend was assembling pieces of information into a coherent whole. "Tell me," Miss Marple said presently, "when you offered Mrs. Shaw your hand to help her down from the rock, did she hesitate before accepting it?" "Yes, actually, she did, just for a moment, as though she wasn't certain she wished to accept assistance from me." "And when she pulled away, did she say anything?" "She said—" He paused, remembering. "She said, 'Thank you, but I prefer to manage alone.' Then she turned toward the water and said she wished to sit quietly for a while before returning home." "To sit quietly," Miss Marple repeated. "Not to walk or to paddle or to do anything in particular. Simply to sit." "Yes, that's right." "And you saw her turn toward the water?" "I saw her take a few steps in that direction. Then I turned away myself and began my walk. I didn't look back." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of rain and the gentle snoring of the elderly gentleman in the corner. Miss Marple's expression had taken on a quality of profound sadness. "Mr. Blunt," she said quietly, "I don't believe you're guilty of Mrs. Shaw's death in any legal sense. But I think you've been carrying a burden of responsibility that, while understandable, may not be entirely accurate." He looked at her with desperate hope. "What do you mean?" "I mean that silence can be misunderstood in many ways. You remained silent because you feared being blamed for something you didn't do, but I wonder whether Mrs. Shaw's silence that evening, her request to be left alone, may have meant something rather different than either of you understood at the time." "I don't follow." "People ask to be left alone for various reasons, Mr. Blunt. Sometimes because they genuinely wish for solitude, but sometimes because they're protecting others from witnessing something they find shameful or distressing. Sometimes because they've made a decision they believe is theirs alone to execute." Understanding dawned slowly on his face, followed by a fresh wave of anguish. "You think she meant that she intended—" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that we cannot know what was in Mrs. Shaw's mind that evening, but I think her actions suggest a woman who had made certain arrangements and wished to be alone to carry them through. The shoes placed carefully on the rock, the deliberate walk into the water, the timing when the tide was at its lowest and she could be certain of—" She stopped, leaving the sentence incomplete. "There were some things that need not be said aloud." Mr. Blunt's voice was hollow. "Then I couldn't have saved her. Even if I'd heard her and turned back, even if I'd gone to her immediately, she would have refused my help just as she refused it when she pulled away from my hand." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said. "Or perhaps your presence might have changed her mind. We cannot know. That's the terrible thing about such moments. They hinge on so many unknowable variables." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes kind but direct. "What I do know, Mr. Blunt, is that your silent since has served no one. Not yourself, certainly, and not the truth of what happened. Fear of scandal is understandable, but it has left you carrying guilt that may not be yours to carry, and it has left others with an incomplete picture of Mrs. Shaw's last hours. What should I do?" "You should speak to Constable Warren," Miss Marple said simply. "Tell him what you've told me. The truth may be uncomfortable, but it's far less corrosive than secrets." Chapter 9. The Difference Between Falling and Being Left. That evening, Constable Warren called at the Bantry's cottage. He arrived just as the last light was fading from the sky, his uniform slightly damp from the earlier rain, his expression suggesting a man who had spent the afternoon wrestling with uncomfortable revelations. "Miss Marple," Seat Mrs. Bantry offered him. just come from speaking with Mr. Blunt. He tells me you encouraged him to come forward with information about the evening Mrs. Shaw died." I suggested that the truth, however uncomfortable, was generally preferable to continued silence, Miss Marple replied. "I hope I didn't overstep my bounds." No, quite the contrary. His account has clarified several matters that had been troubling me, though I'm not certain it makes the overall picture any clearer." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Mr. Blunt says you believe Mrs. Shaw may have intended to take her own life. Is that correct?" "I think it's a possibility that should be considered," Miss Marple said gently. "The arrangement of her shoes, the timing when the tide was at its lowest, her request to be left alone, these details suggest deliberation rather than accident." Constable Warren nodded slowly. "Dr. Haydock mentioned that interpretation to me after the inquest. Said he thought about it but couldn't be certain either way. The water was so shallow, you see. For someone to drown in water that barely covered the ankles would require either complete incapacitation or deliberate intent, and there was no evidence of incapacitation, no blow to the head, no sudden illness that he could detect." "Which leaves deliberate intent," Mrs. Bantry said quietly. "Perhaps. Though there's but another possibility, isn't there?" The constable looked at Miss Marple. "Mr. Blunt described hearing something that might have been a cry. What if Mrs. Shaw did fall, genuinely fell, and called out for help, but no one came? What if she was too weak or disoriented to stand again, and the water, shallow as it was enough?" Miss Marple was silent for a moment, her hands folded in her lap. "That's the terrible uncertainty at the heart of this, isn't it? We cannot know with certainty what Mrs. Shaw intended when she walked into that water, but we can know what happened afterward, and that, I believe, is where the real tragedy lies." "I'm not sure I understand. Mr. Blunt heard something, possibly a cry for help, and didn't investigate. He was absorbed in his own grievances and chose to walk away. That was human, perhaps even understandable, but it was also consequential. If Mrs. Shaw did fall and call out, his response might have saved her life. Instead, he kept walking." Constable Warren shifted uncomfortably. "But he didn't know she needed help. How can a man be held responsible for not responding to a cry he didn't recognize as such?" "He can't, legally," Miss Marple agreed. "And I believe Mr. Blunt is guilty of any crime, but there's a difference, isn't there, between legal guilt and moral responsibility, between an act of commission and an act of omission?" She paused, her gaze drifting to the window where darkness was gathering. "I've been thinking about the various forms of drowning, if you'll forgive such a morbid subject. We think of drowning as an active process, someone struggling against the water, fighting to stay afloat. But there's another kind of drowning that's far quieter, the kind where someone is too tired or too dispirited to fight, where the water doesn't have to be deep because the will to resist is shallow." Mrs. Bantry shivered. "Jane, that's a terrible thought." "Yes, it is, but I think it may be what happened to Mrs. Shaw. I think she walked into that water, whether intending to end her life or merely to sit in quiet despair. And when the moment came to stand again, she found she lacked the strength or the will. Perhaps she called out, perhaps she didn't, but the crucial fact is that Mr. Blunt was nearby, heard something, and chose not to investigate." "You're saying his decision to walk away was the difference between life and death," Constable Warren said. "I'm saying it may have been. We can't know for certain, but I think that uncertainty is what's been haunting Mr. Blunt since that night. Not the certainty of guilt, but the terrible possibility of it." The constable ran a hand through his thinning hair. "So what do we call it then? If it's not murder, and it's not quite suicide, and it's not entirely an accident, what is it?" Miss Marple considered the question. "I think we call it what it is. A death that occurred because someone fell and someone else walked away. The falling may have been accidental or intentional, we cannot know, but the walking away was certainly deliberate, even if its consequences were not fully understood at the time. That's a fine distinction. It is, but I think it's an important one. You see, Constable, I don't believe Mr. Blunt pushed Mrs. Shaw into the water. I don't believe he held her down or prevented her from standing. What he did was far more passive and far more human. He heard something that might have been distress, and he chose to assume it was nothing. He took the comfortable interpretation rather than the alarming one, and by the time he walked back past the cove and discovered she was gone, it was too late to undo that choice. Constable Warren was quiet for a long moment. I'll need to include this in my report. The coroner may want to reconvene the inquest. I think that would be wise, Miss Marple said, not to assign blame necessarily, but to ensure the record reflects what actually happened. Mrs. Shaw's death deserves that much accuracy at least. After the constable had taken his leave, Mrs. Bantry turned to her friend with troubled eyes. Do you really think she meant to take her own life, Jane? It seems so desperate. I think she was in despair, Miss Marple replied. Whether that despair would have led to deliberate self-destruction or merely to a kind of passive surrender, we cannot know. But I keep thinking about what Mr. Blunt said, that she spoke of wanting Miss Mayhew to have a better life than managing a lodging house. That suggests someone thinking about the future, about arrangements, about what would happen after she was gone. Poor woman. Yes, and poor Mr. Blunt, in his way. He'll carry the weight of that unanswered cry for the rest of his life, wondering whether it was real and whether he could have prevented what followed. Miss Marple rose and moved to the window, looking out at the darkness where the sea murmured its eternal rhythm. That's the difference, you see, between falling and being left. Falling might be an accident of balance or a choice made in despair, but being left, being heard and not answered, being in distress and having that distress ignored, that's something else entirely. It's not murder, but it's not innocent either. It exists in that grey space between the two, where law cannot reach but conscience must. What will happen to Mr. Blunt? Nothing in any legal sense, and he committed no crime. But I suspect he's already imposing a sentence upon himself that's far harsher than any court could deliver. The question is whether he can learn to forgive himself for being human, for being fallible and fearful and failing to hear what he should have heard. She turned from the window, her expression gentle but sad. We're all capable of such failures, Dolly. That's what makes this so haunting. It wasn't a moment of evil or malice. It was simply a moment when someone chose the easy interpretation over the difficult one, and by the time the truth became clear, it was too late to go back and choose differently. The room fell into contemplative silence, broken only by the ticking of the clock and the distant sound of waves against the shore. Chapter 10, The Sea That Took Nothing Back. The reconvened inquest took place 3 days later, on a morning when the sea lay calm and silver beneath an overcast sky. The proceedings were brief and considerably more subdued than the first hearing. Mr. Blunt gave his evidence with quiet dignity, describing his encounter with Mrs. Shaw, their conversation, and his failure to investigate the sound he had heard during his walk. The coroner, after listening to this testimony and reviewing de Haydock's medical evidence once more, delivered a revised verdict. Death by drowning, circumstances uncertain. It was not a satisfying conclusion in the conventional sense, but it had the virtue of honesty. Mrs. Shaw had died in the shallow water of Gull's Cove, and whether by accident, despair, or some combination of both would remain a matter of conjecture. Miss Mayhew attended the inquest but did not speak unless directly addressed. She sat very straight in her chair, her face pale but composed, and when it was over she left quickly without speaking to anyone. Miss Marple, observing this, felt a stirring of concern. There had been something in the young woman's expression, not grief exactly, but a kind of strained resolution that suggested burden still being carried. The following afternoon, Miss Marple called once more at Shaw House. The brass plate had already been removed from beside the door, and there was a faint air of abandonment about the place, despite the fact that Miss Mayhew was still in residence. "I'm leaving at the end of the week," Miss Mayhew said when she had shown Miss Marple into the parlour. "The house is being sold. I've found a position as a companion to an elderly lady in Bath. It will be a relief, honestly, to make a fresh start." "I'm sure it will," Miss Marple said gently, "though I imagine these past weeks have been terribly difficult for you." Yes, the single word was clipped, almost offensive. Miss Marple settled into her chair and regarded the younger woman with kind but steady eyes. "Miss Mayhew, may I speak plainly with you?" "I suppose so. I don't believe you've told the complete truth about the evening your aunt died. Not at the inquest, and not in any of our previous conversations. I think there's something you've been holding back, and I think it's causing you considerable distress." Miss Mayhew's hands tightened in her lap. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do. You see, I've been considering the sequence of events that evening, and there are certain elements that don't quite align with your account. You said you retired early with a headache and didn't see your aunt leave the house. But I believe you did see her. I believe you may even have spoken with her." The younger woman's face had gone very white. "That's not—" "Please," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "Let me finish. I'm not accusing you of anything terrible, but I think you've been carrying a burden of guilt that, like Mr. Blunt, may not be entirely yours to carry, and I think that burden is making it very difficult for you to move forward with your life." There was a long silence. Outside, a gull cried once and was answered by another, their voices carrying across the empty space between houses. "She asked me to let her go," Miss Mayhew said at last, her voice barely audible. "That's what I haven't told anyone. She came to my room before she left. I wasn't asleep, though I'd said I had a headache. She stood in the doorway and she said, 'Clara, I'm going for a walk. If I don't come back, I want you to know it wasn't your fault. You've been a good niece, better than I deserved.'" Miss Marple said nothing, allowing the silence to encourage continuation. I asked her what she meant, and she just smiled, this sad, tired smile, and said, "Sometimes the kindest thing is to stop struggling." Then she left. I heard her footsteps on the stairs, heard the front door close, and I stayed in my room. I didn't follow her. I didn't try to stop her. "Because she had asked you not to?" "Yes, but also because—" Miss Mayhew's voice broke slightly. "Because part of me was relieved. Is that terrible to admit? She wasn't an easy woman to live with, Miss Marple. Everything had to be just so, and nothing was ever quite right, and I felt like I was suffocating in this house year after year, with no prospect of anything different. When she said she was selling the house, I thought it was my chance for freedom, and then, when she hinted that she might, that she was going to, you saw it as a solution," Miss Marple finished quietly. "God help me, yes. I didn't actively wish her dead, but when she made it clear that's what she intended, I didn't fight very hard to change her mind. I just let her go, and then the next morning when they found her, I told myself and everyone else that I'd been asleep, that I hadn't known anything. Because how could I explain that I'd let her walk out to her death without trying to stun her?" Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "My dear, you were in an impossible position. Your aunt was a grown woman who had made a decision about her own life. You could have tried to prevent her, yes, but would it have made any difference? If she was truly determined, she would have found another opportunity, another evening hunting when you weren't watching. But I didn't even try." "No, you didn't, and that will always be difficult to live with. But I don't believe you're guilty of causing her death any more than Mr. Blunt is. You were both presented with impossible situations, situations where there were no good choices, only choices with different kinds of pain attached to them." Miss Mayhew wiped at her eyes with an already damp handkerchief. "Mr. Blunt at least tried to help her earlier in the evening. He offered his hand when she needed it. I just let her walk away. Because she asked you to. Because she was your elder and your guardian and the person who had provided for you, and you had been trained all your life to respect her wishes. That's not the same as callousness, Clara. That's the complicated web of duty and love and exhaustion that makes up family relations." The younger woman looked up, her eyes red but searching. "Do you really believe that?" "I do. I've seen many situations in my life where people faced impossible choices and made decisions they later regretted. The human heart is a complicated thing, capable of feeling relief and grief simultaneously, of wanting someone's suffering to end while also wanting them to live. You're not a monster for having felt both things at once." "What should I do?" Go to Bath, Miss Marple said simply. Take your new position, begin again, and when the guilt becomes overwhelming, as I suspect it will from time to time, remember that your aunt made her own choice. She could have asked you for help. She could have spoken to Dr. Haydock or the vicar or anyone else. Instead, she chose to walk down to that cove alone, at a time when the tide was low and the water was shallow, and she chose not to come back. That was her decision, not yours. But I could have stopped her. Perhaps. Or perhaps you would have delayed the inevitable by a few days or weeks, and it would have happened anyway, only in a way that left you with even more guilt and more questions. We can't know. That's the terrible thing about such moments. We can never know what the alternative path would have brought. After Miss Marple had taken her leave, she walked slowly back through the village toward the Bantry's cottage. Her path took her past the cove, and she paused there for a moment, looking out at the water that rippled gently in the afternoon breeze. The tide was coming in, though it would never rise very high. Even at its fullest, the water here remained benign, unsuited to tragedy. And yet tragedy had found its way here nonetheless, not through the violence of waves or the depth of water, but through the quieter mechanisms of human despair and human failure. Miss Marple thought about Mrs. Shaw walking down to this cove in the gathering dusk, removing her shoes and placing them carefully on the rock. She thought about the woman sitting in the shallow water, perhaps calling out once or twice, perhaps not. She thought about Mr. Blunt, walking along the beach absorbed in his grievances, hearing something and choosing not to investigate. She thought about Clara Mayhew, sitting in her room and listening to her aunt's footsteps descending the stairs. None of them had committed murder. All of them would carry guilt. That was the real mystery, Miss Marple reflected. Not how Mrs. Shaw had died, that was clear enough now, but how ordinary people, decent people, could find themselves in situations where every choice led to pain, where action and inaction were equally weighted with consequence. The sea in the end had taken nothing that wasn't already being released. Mrs. Shaw had walked into it willingly, whether seeking peace or merely surrender. The water had simply been there, shallow and accommodating, ready to receive what was being offered. Miss Marple turned away from the cove and continued her walk. Behind her, the waves continued their patient work, smoothing the sand, erasing footprints, keeping their eternal counsel. The village would go on, as villages always did. People would remember Mrs. Shaw for a while, and then the memory would fade, replaced by newer tragedies and fresher gossip. But Miss Marple would remember. She would remember the shoes placed facing the sea, the voices heard after dark, the hand that let go, and the silence that was misunderstood. She would remember because that was what she did. She paid attention to the small